Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you so much for being here and for being here on time. Very much appreciated. And I've lost seminar 3 where you're at now. So I'd like to introduce to you Sam Davies, who works at Digital Noir.
Hi.
Hi. Sam trained as a graphic designer, then worked his way up the web design world as a freelancer on a 6-year-long sabbatical in London. In 2011, upon his return to Adelaide, he embarked on creating a digital studio that would align with his personal ethics and style to provide a level of service not currently available here in SA. Well done to you. Digital Noir was born in 2011 with Sam at the lead, got 1 contract designer, and 5 years later they're a core team of 8. And we've been working with Sam to design our helping hand way app, which you'll get to preview tonight. So welcome, Sam, over to you.
Cheers, Wendy. Hi, everybody. So Wendy asked me to have a chat today in and around, I suppose, the world of mobile apps and digital technology, which is kind of where I work and play. So I probably don't need to go through too much of it. Oh, I've got to click down here. It's going to be very confusing for me. Go through too much about what we do, and I suppose I'm not here to sell that to you. But yeah, Digital Noir is a team of we like to think of ourselves probably more as strategists as opposed to just pure web design, app development. We like to think that we bring more to the table than just pure design and development. There's a lot of ins and outs, both working in the web and in the app world in terms of, I suppose, from start to finish in a project, thinking about content strategy, about creative marketing, digital marketing, as well as the tech side of things or the creative side of things. So we work with a lot of Australian and South Australian businesses to build mobile applications. So over the last 5 years since I've been back in Adelaide, we've developed a whole range of different apps, and I'll talk a bit more about them later. When I was thinking about what to chat through today, initially I was going to talk about business apps and why potentially you need a business app, and I started thinking about that process and kind of came back to the thought that before you even realise I need an app, you need to realise why you need an app or why to be in this place, in this environment in the first place. I think I'm in a lucky position, and most of us in this room are probably the same, where we grew up on the cusp of pre-internet world and a post-internet world. And it's actually been pretty crazy changes in the last 30 years, and specifically in the last 10 years it's been really drastic change. And I think actually going through this presentation I started realising how drastic that change has really been in the last 10 years, and it's quite interesting to go back and have a look at the phases. So that's what we're going to have a do today. But can I ask you, who doesn't have a smartphone in the room here today? That's fairly telling. And who hasn't used it today at least once? This is the kind of world we live in now. So we'll go back and have a look at sort of how we got there, I suppose, and then what we can do with it. So if we go back to kind of 40 years ago, 35 years ago when I was born, technology had a different kind of face on it. It wasn't in our homes, it definitely wasn't in our pockets. It was more in the realms of scientists and NASA and science fiction to a certain degree as well. I don't think people generally, before the advent of the personal computer, had that much of an idea about what computers did. Around about the same time that this kind of thing was happening, you had people like, before that. So this is where we are now. So coming forward, in 35 years we've gone from that to a whole new world basically, where the geeks have kind of taken over, and I don't know, we're all wearing headsets and going into crazy places that we hadn't dreamt of. So if we go back and have a bit of a look at the history, come back to this guy, around about the same time that he was sitting there on his computer, you had guys like this who were actually thinking about what was going to happen. So this is Steve Jobs from Apple. In 1983 he had a talk where he talked about a lot of the things that we're experiencing today. So the idea of walking around and checking your email, the idea of a sort of cloud of computers that talk to each other, things that at that time most people really did see as science fiction and didn't see as something that potentially was going to happen. And as we go through this journey, we'll sort of start seeing a curve that people like Steve and other people like him sort of, I suppose, saw a few years ahead and understood that things were going to change, and they were going to change really quickly. So let's start having a look at that change. So if we jump forward maybe 10 years from there, into the early 90s, a time we all remember. So, personal computers are now in our houses, at work. We've got Microsoft Word, we're using word processors. It's becoming sort of common parlance, I suppose. People have mobile phones. We've got early mobile apps like Snake, which was hugely popular at the time. You think how simple that is, but it's only sort of 15, 20 years ago that was something really cool. And we're starting to sort of, I suppose, become used to the idea of computers in our home. But at this time, the internet hadn't really properly taken off. Early internet, especially in Australia, we had dial-up modems, and some people have it, but it wasn't changing our lives in any dramatic way. It definitely wasn't changing the economy on a whole. Obviously, we had a dot-com boom, but it didn't shake up industries as like what was going to happen in the next preceding years. And a lot of that had to do with usage of the internet. And if we start looking at some of these graphs, and these are the sort of exponential graphs that we see all across this, with the pickup of technology and the take-up of things like social media and other forms of technology, they all seem to follow this, not quite, but almost exponential curve. So if we go back to 1998, sitting around here, we have a few internet users, but it's not at the point even 2-3 years later where you're reaching this sort of saturation where most people in the Western world, at this stage at least, do have a connection at home, and it's starting to filter down into business. So we start seeing things like the whole music industry being really shaken up by technology. So file sharing, some of you might remember Napster and LimeWire and these kind of programs, which was very much sort of when I was in high school, so I loved it because I had a huge collection of music all of a sudden. But obviously, it decimated the golden era of the music industry at that stage anyway, shook it up at least, and opened avenues for things like iTunes, which was a pretty radical idea at the time. People thought that they were crazy saying they were going to sell music online for $1 a track. So again, seeing ahead of the path and understanding what people are going to be willing to do a few years down the track. And I suppose at this time there were other technology shifts happening, so things were becoming digital, and we were getting used to having items that we could essentially take around and carry in our pocket. Phones were becoming a bit smarter in the early 2000s, but I'm pretty sure I still had a little flip Nokia up until around about 2008. So it wasn't you had Blackberries and things in the business world, but it really wasn't commonplace. That all started changing in the late 2000s. It's actually, really only 10 years ago to think back, but a lot has happened since then. And if we think back, I remember when Facebook was launched publicly anyway, and when the iPhone came out, I wasn't that excited about the iPhone. I was working in web design at the time. I was sort of in the industry to a certain extent, but I didn't see the, wow, this is such a huge game-changing moment. Obviously, it sort of turned out to be that way, but what then became available was this idea of a computer in your pocket that you could connect with people, you could browse photos, you could do a whole lot more than was possible even 2-3 years before that. Digital cameras had obviously come in around that same era, but now all of a sudden we have it in our pocket. At the same time, we're seeing a really big rise in internet usage. 3G is becoming available. So I think the whole story of this has become that connectivity. So the more connected we get, the more companies and people with ideas are able to bring new business models into the play to sort of tie that in. Google jumped in. It seems like longer than that when I think back to it, but only a few months after the iPhone release, Android was released. So, it was very quickly we went from sort of a no smartphone world to people quickly wanting to jump on the bandwagon. And once we start looking at those graphs of that, you see how quickly people started adopting to the new technology. So as a part of that, I suppose the word app actually became into common usage. We all had apps before that. We had Microsoft Word, we had Excel. These are software applications, but mobile app and due to branding from people like Google and Apple, took on a new terminology. So if you remember, there's an app for that campaign that came out. But essentially a mobile app is just a software application that you can use on a phone or a tablet or a watch or sunglasses or a fridge. It's just something that could be as simple as a torch device on a phone going through to crazy complex project management software. Early on though, there was a lot of apps that were quite frivolous, I suppose. Gaming, entertainment, social media was there. So, I mean, the first year of the App Store, these were some of the, second year maybe for Angry Birds, some of the biggest apps on the market. So it hadn't quite infiltrated the business world so much, unless you're a game developer at the time, or with productivity tools and things like that. But it was still seen as a kind of frivolous or niche market for app developers. And I remember, at the time there was a lot of people talking about, geez, there's an app for that, who cares, just shut up, we don't want to hear about apps. And I think in my world, and I talk to probably 3-4 people a week that have app ideas that come in and talk about apps, and some businesses, they're still kind of a bit stuck in that mentality of that time, thinking that apps are a frivolous tool or something that is a game or a small kind of set it and forget it item, as opposed to either being a business that you can really grow, or a tool for your business that can connect with your staff or your organisation. And then we'll go back to another graph looking at, this is the number of apps on the App Store, and we see that same trend again. It's just it just booms exponentially, and that's not even 10 years there, it's about 8 years. I think it's up at around about just under 3 million on the Apple App Store now, so there's a lot of competition. But I mean, what happened though is, you did have these giants, so Facebooks of the world. In the industry, they kind of call them unicorns because they're, a mythical beast that doesn't come along that often. But they, started getting really powerful, and early on, sort of 3-4 years after Facebook, launched publicly, 3-4 years after the device that it was mainly running on became publicly available, you've got them throwing around some pretty serious dollars to start purchasing other apps. So Instagram got purchased for $1 billion in 2013, which was a big deal at the time. And going back to that mentality of there's an app for that, a lot of people still have this mentality that I can build an app and sell it to Yahoo for $40 million and get rich, get quick. And there are these stories. This UK kid, he was 15, sold an app he built which took news articles and truncated them down to short digestible forms for $30 million. So they do happen, but it's kind of, I suppose, a bit of a myth. There's a lot of Today Tonight stories about this kind of stuff, people getting rich, but it's not necessarily the be-all and end-all of why to be on the App Store or on someone's phone at all. Saying that, the next year Facebook bought WhatsApp for $20 billion. So again, looking forward, you've got people like Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook seeing what's going to happen a few years ahead of the time. So WhatsApp's a messaging app. It's actually quite a nice success story because the guy that built it was a Ukrainian refugee that came over to California in the mid-90s and developed it by himself in his garage and made a lot of money. But it's a simple messaging app, like Facebook Messenger, something like that. It's still around today, but Zuckerberg and Facebook obviously saw the value and what was going to happen in the next few years in terms of how many people are actually going to be there paying attention, so willing to pay pretty big bucks for it. And that's kind of looking at these kind of figures. So in blue we can see internet usage on desktop, PCs, laptops, and in green we've got mobile phone usage. This is actually a few years old now. In Australia it's more up around 10 hours per day between phone and desktop. But it kind of shows you, we didn't just replace our internet usage from, some of this is work obviously as well, but we've added on this extra phone time. And I think we all sort of know when that is. Smartphone usage in Australia boomed in exactly the same way, 25% rise in 2 years. I think it's up closer to 17, so almost a smartphone per person in Australia, 17 million that is. So I think about 80% of us own some sort of smart device. An interesting figure that has come out of all of this is what's happening in the developing world. So other technologies, so the personal computing revolution in the 80s, early 90s, television, radio, actually were really slow to get adopted in the developing world. So television, for example, had sort of a 10, 20, some places 30 years gap between what was happening in the West and what was happening in some of the developing countries. But due to the lack of infrastructure, cellular technology took off really big in places like Africa and India in the late 90s. So they had this cellular grid. So sort of really big groundwork was already laid for mobile phones to come in with internet usage. So this is a graph of mobile internet users in India. I think this figure is really interesting, that 110 million rural Indian mobile internet users. So we are looking at a really sort of quite global phenomenon that's happening, and it isn't just sort of the privileged few that are sitting there on Facebook. The whole world has sort of bought into this connected mobile world that we're living in. Looking at what has changed within these 10 years in apps, so we started off with these sort of more frivolous style apps, then slowly we're moving towards tools that, and this is the top of the App Store I think from the end of last year, tools that connect us and tools that can help us in certain ways. During this time, as more and more people flooded to the internet, as more and more people are being connected and sitting on their phones, we've got businesses thinking about ways, well, how can we get our foot in the door here? So number 9 there is Uber, which I'm sure you've all heard about. Clean Master. I think it's like a clear your browser cache or clear your phone. Like, I would imagine so, yeah. It's interesting, you've still got a flashlight up there, like whoever is that. So you've got these kind of brands that have just really jumped out of nowhere within the last 5, 10 years, some of them. And what's interesting about these types of companies is that they really don't actually own anything. So Uber is the largest taxi company in the world, and it doesn't have one full-time employee, doesn't own any infrastructure, doesn't own one taxi. Facebook's the world's biggest media center, doesn't create any content. Alibaba, which is the Chinese e-commerce giant, which is actually coming to Australia this year, has no inventory. Everything is third party. And Airbnb, which some of you might have used, doesn't own any hotels. So it's crazy how these companies have come in and really changed the game in terms of they're selling access as opposed to selling a product. And I suppose what a lot of that is called is disruption, and you hear disruption a lot in the industry about big industries being disrupted. So in the late 90s you had the music industry, you had Blockbuster as a good example. Blockbuster actually initially got really hurt by the initial Netflix, which was sending out postage services of DVDs. But going forward, I think what has happened with the industries that have been disruptive, they've sort of been the easy pickings so far. There's a lot of other industries that are out there. The healthcare industry in particular, I think, and education's another big one, where there's a lot of room for new inventive ideas and digital tools to come in and really change things up. So, based looking on that graph that we keep looking at, I don't see this is changing anytime soon. So, as opposed to being a scary thing, which is how a lot of businesses look at this, I think it's something to be embraced and, offer that opportunity to get ahead of the curve early on and start thinking, how can we do that? There's no reason why Blockbuster couldn't have pulled a Netflix, or Yellow Cabs couldn't have been Uber. The opportunity was there. And part of this is kind of leveling the playing field. So if we look at, I suppose, a kind of spread of how people are using their phones these days to consume apps, there's a pretty even spread between social media, entertainment, communication, productivity, and more so e-commerce. Australia is kind of lagging a bit on the e-commerce front. Even when I was in the UK 5 years ago, e-commerce was sort of, I think, 3 or 4 years ahead of where we are here. I think it's happening now. We've got Amazon coming in this year. I think all of us are becoming more confident buying, especially on our PCs, desktops, but now on our phones too, actually making purchases. But some of the apps that we've worked on over the last few years, it's really broad. So we've worked with entrepreneurs who've had an idea. So for example, we built an app called Beer Power, which finds you the cheapest beer, which Paul Cameron's been running for 2.5 years now and doing really well. We've built things for non-profits, so Kidney Health Australia, we built sort of an educational, informative, interactive brochure for them. We've done quite a bit of e-commerce. Simple business tools like a booking system for a car wash, or pure educational tools for schools or government bodies that want to get out information. So there's a whole different range of apps. It's not just going back to simple games, and the Helping Hand app we have a look at will sort of illustrate that, I think. Oh, this is more of the charts. This chart's kind of scary when you see how quickly, from 1950 we've zoomed up in terms of our technology. People are saying that it's starting to potentially slow down a bit, but it has been a really drastic change during most of our lives. I think that's actually illustrated really well here. If you look at the top 10 global companies by market cap 10 years ago, there's one software company, Microsoft, and 10 years later we've got the top 5, Apple, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, and Tencent is actually a Chinese tech company as well. So it's a pretty drastic change, not just in terms of lifestyle and social media, but the global economy and who the big power players are from an economic point of view. So that's kind of the last 10 years. But let's take a bit of a look at where we are now in 2017. So one way that I like to talk about why we want to be on the App Store, or why we want to be having a mobile presence, is it's about attention. So what we've just seen is people are spending more and more time on their phones, on the internet, connected basically, through these digital devices. It provides a really great avenue for organisations and businesses, not just from a commercial sense, but for good means as well, to actually connect with people that previously it wasn't available. And at the end of the day, that is where people's attention is right now. So if you're not there, you're actually missing out on being able to talk. So building an app is obviously one of the ways that you can get in that conversation, but there's a whole slew of other sort of digital methods to get involved. We can run through a couple of them. So integrating with existing apps is something that most businesses need to do these days. You can imagine if you're a small restaurant, if you're not on Yelp or some sort of review rating site, menu log, these type of tools, people, unless you're around the corner and they know that you're good, are going to struggle to find you. And when they do start researching, which people do all the time now, that you're going to struggle to get the business that you need. A mobile-friendly website is definitely something that you need to have in 2017. And then going into online advertising, mobile advertising, which is just going to become more and more prevalent. I think the industry, they're saying it's going to be worth $200 billion at the end of next year for mobile advertising alone. And some of the data we'll look at in a minute from last year's census in terms of young Australians and how they perceive mobile advertising, it's actually much more trusted than you would think. So there's a whole different bunch of ways to get into this sphere without necessarily building your own custom app. Here's a few stats of mobile realities in Australia. So this is for 2016. Up to 10 hours a day, most Aussies are spending looking at some form of digital device. I think 70% of that is based on your phone, and from that, 80% of the time is spent in apps. So you can imagine a lot of it is Facebook, a lot of it is social media style apps, and then browsing the web. But there's also a lot of other tools that people are using. You have things like Fitbit and this sort of connected world that people are becoming involved with, wearables. Some other stats. This is an interesting one, and definitely guilty of that. 50% of smartphone users grab their phone immediately upon waking up. Again, from a business perspective, thinking about that, that's a really powerful tool. I don't think people were grabbing a newspaper 10 years ago, no I wasn't, or grabbing a magazine the first thing when they woke up. So having that power of connectivity there at your fingertips is quite interesting. 84% of smartphone shoppers turn to their mobile phone to help them shop while in a store. I definitely do that. And I think that's another indication of these things are becoming kind of companions to our lives. Like whether or not it's scary or not, it's kind of what is happening. I think what comes next is probably more scary than having the phone in your hand, but we're definitely using them to influence our decisions. So this was, Australians are 30% more likely to make a purchase or engage with a brand based on mobile advertising over television or print. I think that, television is obviously sort of fading out with the likes of subscription-based models and the internet being easier to watch, content on. So we've got YouTube and other apps like that, which we can find our entertainment and find the entertainment that we want as opposed to pre-programmed. And then 40% of millennials research their purchases on smartphones. And there's probably a whole other talk about how the generation under me, how they're going to be purchasing and buying. And I think if we're looking at that curve again, they're the people that we need to be thinking about in the next 10, 20 years, because they're the ones that are going to be making purchasing decisions and then coming through facilities like Helping Hands. And they're going to have grown up all through this. So not being there in 10, 15 years is going to be... It's going to be kind of catastrophic, I suppose, because that's just what they've grown up with. When we're not at work, this is the kind of places we are on our phone, which I think is probably fairly commonplace for all of you. Or at work as well.
Not the last one.
An event?
I used to use my phone at events.
Yeah, that's nice. I saw.
Photos. No, I take sort of right at the beginning, and that's it, goes away.
I went to a gig recently and everybody had their phone up and I was like, I felt bad taking it out. I do tend to agree. Watching television is actually a really interesting one. There's a really great report put out last year by the Census report about social media use in Australia. If anyone wants a copy, I'm happy to email it through to you. It's actually really interesting, but social media use during television is huge. Most people are just sitting on their phones, especially network television. If there's ads, people aren't watching ads on TV anymore. There. Yeah. I find this kind of scary though, because thinking about how we are using our phones and the kind of research that you're doing, a lot of Australians, especially small and medium businesses, aren't really there. They're still thinking, Facebook or social media is kind of a luxury item or something that doesn't apply to my business. It doesn't necessarily have to be Facebook, although Facebook is really the #1 social media in Australia. It has much more permutation in Australia than some other countries. I think 95% of people on social media in Australia, so people that are willing to sign up to something, are on Facebook. So for a small business not to be somewhere where pretty much all of their clients are it's an interesting decision. It's probably the wrong decision. Some of the stuff that came out of the census was Australians trust brands more with a social presence, trust online advertising, we talked about that, more than TV. Online advertising is still relatively cheap. Talking about this curve and seeing ahead of it, I wish 5 years ago I'd invested $10,000 in Facebook advertising, because it was super cheap and you could access a lot of people, and it would have been great for my business, but I sort of slept on it. Now it's becoming more expensive, but being able to see some of those things early and sort of cash in on it can be great. But in comparison to, say, taking out a print ad in the advertiser or a magazine, or running television, of course, or radio, it's still quite cheap. And the segmentation of it is great. So same with apps, but with Facebook advertising, you can really pinpoint who you want to target. Beer Power, for example, one of the apps we work on, Paul can send out an ad to people in Mawson Lakes aged between 18 to 35 that drink Corona and have opened the app today. So it really is very targeted means for advertising. We have the power to do remarketing as well. So remarketing is when you visit a site, you look at something and say, I want to buy a tent, and then all of a sudden I see these images for tents all over the web. So what that site has done is actually put a tracking code from me, found out who I am, and then pinging adverts back to me. That's kind of scary. I don't personally mind it. I prefer to be advertised stuff I want as opposed to stuff I don't want. But it's these are very powerful tools. So it's interesting that especially small and medium Australian businesses, I think this next chart is adoption of advertising, is still pretty low. Around 20% of small and medium businesses are actually actively online advertising in social media channels or other online channels, which is a bit scary, I think. And so I think a few years ago you could say that getting into these places really wasn't an opportunity, but I think now it's a necessity. Looking at where this chart is going, where our consumption is going, it's not going down anytime soon. So especially if you want to compete and you want to be trusted, having that presence is really important. So we really like working with local business to have that vision, because I think it does take a bit of courage, especially in established business that still can't see that what's happened in the last 10 years. And I think it gets lost in the midst of everyday business. You still might think, well, running a Facebook ad or building an app is outside of what we do as a core business. We're not a media company, or we're not a development company, but they really need to be seen as tools to help your existing business. So the Helping Hand Way, Helping Hand approached us talking about a new program they're running to do with training and encouraging behaviour and culture changes within the organisation and within the staff, and how potentially mobile technology could help facilitate that. So we talked about ways that we can further engage with staff and have, I suppose, a two-way conversation using these kind of devices that allow a greater level of intimacy than you'd have just going to a training course and then not having that feedback, and be able to feedback both ways, but also track your progress and leave set some goals and be able to follow up on that. So as well as that, acting as a companion to existing offline content, so your traditional brochures or PDFs or handouts that you might get at the end of a training, which generally you probably don't actually go back and feed back to. Taken for granted that people are going to be here when they wake up in the morning, when they come home from night, when they're out on their coffee break. Having the ability to communicate directly to them is really powerful. And the ability on a native app, as opposed to doing a website or some other sort of strategy through social media, is that it's direct and can be really controlled to what Helping Hand wanted. So some of the things that we really wanted to put in place was a tool for my actions. So rather than just having a set of sort of static information that can go and read, basically a digital brochure, we wanted to have a tool where I can go in there and record videos talking about my goals, or flagging areas of the training that I want to come back to and readdress, and have the ability to let the app remind me and keep me in check, I suppose, of where I am at in my progress. On the flip side of that, also push back messages to the organisation, perhaps suggesting things could be done better, or I'm happy with how things are done, or talking about my own personal whys. So here's some examples of the sharing an opportunity for positive change. So choosing to record a video and talk about something that you think could be done better, or a positive change within the organisation, or even going back and talking about how you think something's been done really great. So actually wanting to give a shout out to a teammate who's done something good on the job. as well as some of these sort of more complex features with the video recording, we have the ability to stay in touch with news and push in, I suppose, more traditional media. But the benefit of that is it's always there on the phone. We can use push notifications to get directly in touch with the staff and have that ongoing conversation. Keep the content fresh. And that stems right back through, so the actual training itself. So when we're going through the training, we can actually use the app as a companion and flag goals or enter activity that we want to look at further down the process. So I was going to go through some of the live screens, but we don't have the connection here, so we'll just we need like an Apple TV or something, so it's fine. But I do have it on my phone if we want to have a look, so. Cool. Interestingly, we were talking in the office yesterday about this history and how things have changed so much. In 30 years, things like, in 10 years' time, things like newspapers are not going to be common parlance, especially for the generation below me. But a lot of what we can do within the Helping Hand app, would have been quite difficult to, a lot of man hours and a lot of paperwork to facilitate, even going back 10, 15 years. So it really is quite amazing what you can pack into this small device and how much of a conversation you can have. I think that's the nice way to think about it. People's attention are there. Do we have the ability to actually have a real conversation? I think a lot of people look at it as just a commercial marketing tool, but it has a lot of impact in other areas as well. A quick look at the future. It's a funny future. I thought I'd focus a little bit on sort of healthcare, considering we're kind of in that area, and I think it's actually something that is going to be really big in the next 5 years. So this sort of whole trend of wearables, things like watches and shoes that track how fast you're running, heart meters, are becoming pretty commonplace. You had Google talking about the glasses and things. They haven't really taken off, and VR is becoming sort of more and more commonplace. Still hasn't really taken off, I suppose, in the mainstream, but in the next few years I feel like it's really going to. But outside of just tracking how far you've jogged in the morning, there's actually a real impact that can be felt within the healthcare world, starting from preventative measures through to enjoying a healthy lifestyle, but then going through into actual healthcare itself and diagnostics. So with what's happening in Australia at the moment with consumer-directed care coming in, this is a time when a lot of people in the industry are looking to, we actually have to innovate now because we have to compete. So looking at some of the ways that mobile technology can help improve patients' life or help improve clients' life is going to be massive. So you've got things like remote health, so the ability to have remote GPs or remote carers that can tap in via video and maybe even use tools like heart monitors, other diagnostics that can be run remotely to facilitate that. Digital diagnostics is a big one. So again, outside of simple heart meters, there's people can install things internally to check stents and how they're going in arteries. There's tools out there now which are sort of looking at things like Alzheimer's and degenerative brain disease and actually mapping changes in the brain and able to literally look at my smartphone and sort of assess how my brain health is. And I think those kind of tools are definitely going to be becoming more and more available over the next 10 years. One thing, I was talking to someone from Royal Adelaide Hospital, when they get people coming in into emergency now, they check their Apple Health, if they have it, or a Fitbit, to see how active they have been, because your recovery rates in a serious injury is much higher if you're an active person as opposed to more sedentary. So these tools are actually going to have quite a long-lasting effect in some places where they can be really life-saving, I suppose. Another big one, I think, is just general admin. So any big organisation suffers from coming out of sort of a legacy environment where there's a lot of paperwork, so booking systems and client patient management, placing carers and patients together. So there's lots of different avenues, I think, within the health sector, in Australia in particular, over the next few years that, that can be addressed. So I suppose taking all that into consideration and looking where things are going, there's a really good video I'd like to show you that kind of shows what's happening elsewhere in the world that are maybe actually a few years ahead of us. So we think about China, 20 years ago has probably been behind the race, but now they're really jumping ahead, especially in this part of the industry and the way their lifestyles are integrated with their phones. So if I am able to pull this up.
If you're sitting in the United States or Europe right now, you've probably never used a Chinese app. But the reality is, if you want to know how the internet will develop, China, the land once known for its cheap ripoffs, has actually become a guide to the future. You know, the internet is the internet. But for China, the internet is more like an intranet. It's largely walled off from the Western world by this incredibly complex system of filters and blocks that we call the Great Firewall. And basically, the Great Firewall blocks any foreign site the Communist Party doesn't think it can control. So that means there is no Facebook, no Twitter, no Google. Instead, what filled the internet vacuum was a generation of Chinese copycats that have grown into huge companies. So for Google, you had Baidu. For YouTube, you had Youku. For Twitter, you had Sina Weibo, and the list goes on and on. It's almost as if the Chinese internet is a lagoon as an aside to the greater ocean of the internet. And in that lagoon, there are these swamp monster apps that bear some resemblance to the creatures in the ocean, but are mutated in some ways because they evolved in a different kind of environment. But things have started to shift in the sense that before, no one outside of the lagoon really cared about the swamp monsters. But now all of a sudden, some of the features they've developed are so amazing that Western apps are trying to copy them. And the greatest example of this is WeChat. WeChat is an example of, for lack of a better word, a super app. It's a Swiss Army knife that basically does everything for you. It's your WhatsApp, Facebook, Skype, and Uber. It's your Amazon, Instagram, Venmo, and Tinder. But it's other things we don't even have apps for. There are hospitals that have built out whole appointment booking systems. There are investment services. There are even heat maps that show how crowded a place is, be it your favorite shopping mall or a popular tourist site. The list of services goes on basically forever. But it's not the variety of things you can do on WeChat that makes it so powerful. It's the fact that they're all in one app. So why does that matter? Hypothetically, imagine you're sitting at home and one day you notice your corgi is dirty. You open WeChat, hit a few buttons, and a few hours later a man shows up at your door with some shampoo and a big vacuum. Your dog gets cleaned and he looks great. You take a photo, you share it with your friends, and tag the dog cleaning business. You haven't left the app. Your friend who likes Hello Kitty and works a boring office job is slacking off at work and looking at WeChat. She sees the photo of your clean corgi. She decides she wants her poodle cleaned. She clicks the tag on your photo and orders the same service. Within seconds, the man with the big vacuum is on his way to her house. She pays him, and he's happy because he got paid instantly on WeChat. She starts chatting with you to thank you. Neither of you have left the app. While chatting, she tells you about a new hip noodle joint. She says, you have to come. It's a schlep, but you accept. She orders food while still at her desk. You order a taxi. She pays for the food. On the way to her house, the man with the big vacuum invests the money he earned from both of you into a wealth management product that's probably a little too risky. Neither of you nor the man with the big vacuum have left the app. Both of you arrive and the app tells the kitchen you're there. Your WeChat profile photo pops up on the wall. It's an old photo from the year you had that weird part in your hair. Of course she makes a comment. Your food is served. You notice your meat is a bit overcooked, so you snap a photo and post a disparaging restaurant review. You're already on your phone and you remember you still owe your friend money because she paid. You transfer her money. Neither of you, the man with the big vacuum, nor the restaurant have left the app. At the restaurant, there are no menus, there are no waiters, there is no cashier. There is only WeChat. By rolling so many functions into one single app, it's altered the concept of virality. It's no longer just videos or images or tweets that can go viral. It's a dog washer, noodles, all sorts of companies and products that get the push of a social network. Here in China, that network is 700 million people. Sounds great, right? Well, it is, but using a single app to find a date, schedule an oil change, or notarize a document also enables WeChat to collect a staggering volume of personal data. They know what you talk about, who you talk about it with, what you read, where you go, why you're going there, who's there, how you spend money when you're online, how you spend money when you're offline. The list goes on indefinitely. For advertisers, this is a miracle. It's the combined data of Facebook, Amazon, Google, and PayPal, all in one place. The problem is, all of the data is information Chinese companies are forced to share with the Chinese government, which has a long record of human rights violations and isn't exactly shy about stalking its citizens. So if you're not in China, why does this matter? It matters because we're starting to see a number of Western tech companies attempt to replicate super apps like WeChat. For the companies, it's incredibly powerful, and for you and me, it's a convenient and even transformative technology. But of course, it could also be problematic. Concentrating so much data in so few hands could lay the groundwork for an Orwellian world where companies and governments can track every single movement you make.
Crazy. I think I was watching it with my wife the other day, and she was freaked out. And sort of like, it really is there, I suppose. And you think about that whole process that they went through. It's not that far away from what we can do here right now, but it gives you, I suppose, insight into that dog washer really needs to be there within the hemisphere of WeChat in that example, but whatever it is here. So hopefully that gives you a bit of insight into sort of where we've got to now. It's probably another whole conversation about the types of things that businesses and organisations can do to take it to that next step. But hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into what the future holds and what we need to do to thrive in it. Cheers.
Thank you.